All right. So thank you, Burt Pusch, for joining the class today. I'll just say a little bit about you and introduce you, and then ask some questions, and you'll obviously respond. But you are working with the Member Voices program at the Commonwealth Care Alliance, working to ensure that all people's perspectives, all communities' perspectives, are heard in the Commonwealth Care Alliance's work, which is devoted to promoting access, if I understand correctly, for low-income and elderly people in their health care.
It's basically healthcare.
Healthcare
for seniors and persons with complex care needs.
Okay, great. Focused here in Massachusetts. Prior to doing that, you did similar work I think in Washington State, looks like in Austin and Texas and Illinois, and that seems to be one of the major trajectories of your work, which I want to ask you a little bit more about as well. You've also in the past done some research for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the Rehabilitation Services Administration. In addition to that, you are also an educator, providing educational programming for post-secondary education at MIT and the Mass Institute of Art and Design. You've also done work with service dog organizations such as the Purdy Prison Pet Partnership. So you've done a lot of work in a lot of different areas. And maybe we could just start a little bit more about you. In all that work, what do you see as your main aim? What is it that you are generally trying to achieve, and what do you call that work?
I think the most important thing I've done, that's the thread that runs throughout my career, is I'm in intent on changing what people think about and define this thing they call disability. Because I don't see it at all like society in general sees it, or I was brought up to perceive it. Mm-hmm. Disability as a function of multiple elements, perhaps the least important of which is a person's body, and more importantly has to do with paradigms, like what is the meaning and value they assign to their difference? What is the meaning and value the society around them assigns to that difference? And then the degree to which we have supports in the environment that allow them to express their abilities, given that their bodies are different.
And that actually sort of jumps to my next question about your thoughts about the word disability. I was going to ask you how much of that, so maybe you could elaborate just a bit more, how much of that is constructed by our society, a society that's designed to meet a limited part of the population's needs.
Well, let's just start with the word.
What's that?
I'm being defined as, quote, disabled. Hello?
Right. I mean, we don't, for example, we don't say that wearing glasses is an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
So say more about, how much of disability is about, as you said, our society's definition versus, let's say, I don't know the right wording exactly, but a natural limitation. If I could say.
It's, or a difference. We're all born different. Some of us are able to do things like, I don't know, can you write and play music? Are you that? No. People are. So are you disabled? See, I mean, is that really a construct we want to pursue? Because people's bodies work differently sometimes, and their minds and their brains have different capacities. And so I would say that the majority of it, I don't know, percentage-wise, I don't think anyone's ever done that, but I would say the majority of it, 90% plus, has nothing to do with the person's body and everything to do with how society frames it and responds to the differences. For example, in a lot of the training that I do, I talk about two different disability individuals, and these are somewhat created, but they're also based on my personal experience. We talk about Bob and Mary a lot. And Bob is missing his left hand and considers himself totally disabled, whereas Mary is paralyzed from the neck down, and she's the CEO of a company. So tell me, what is this thing we call disability? It all has to do with how we framed it. And I think it's a huge gross injustice to keep using the word the disabled, because it puts you in a box that you don't actually belong in. It's not reflective of my body at all. It's reflective of many other things.
So that sort of framing obviously is probably taking a bigger toll, and I want to get to that in a couple minutes with the pandemic and sort of, again, how we've sort of reinforcing some of those, the limitations of our society versus people living here. but the thing we've been working on this week in my class is about looking at how pandemics, or this pandemic in particular, deepens existing inequalities or vulnerabilities or marginalization. And what I've been emphasizing is that we need to pay more attention, not just me, of course, need to pay more attention to these disparities as they exist sort of in normal times. So maybe you could say a little bit about how, and this is really, I think, the meat of our conversation, what are some of the daily concerns and challenges that you're seeing and advocating on behalf of? How is this pandemic really straining, if that's the proper word, you can correct me, the lives of people who are living with
differences,
disabilities?
Yeah. Well, it's a hard question to respond to because as I said, everybody's very unique. So you can group things, but even when you do that, it depends in part on the degree to which the person with the, let's call it a difference instead of disability, the person with the difference has prepared and or thought about adapting their environment to the way their body works. For example, in the news, there have been numerous reports about how some individuals with different differences have trouble getting the food that's delivered to their door because it's dropped outside on the floor outside their apartment, say, have no means, they've never thought about how they might pick something up off the floor, or they're not able to go out to a curbside pickup to get the food because they haven't really thought about how they'd accomplish that. Again, it goes back to perhaps the Bob analogy, right? I'm totally disabled, I can't do this, there's no way I can figure this out, so I'm helpless. And I bet Mary, again, referring back to the earlier example, would be going, let's see, if someone drops something off at the curbside, can I go out and get it? Can my PCA go out and get it? Do I have someone else? Maybe I have a service dog. And so all of those things have been put into play by somebody who's very proactive and thinking in a very positive way about their biological differences.
Just to stick with that example about food delivery for people who are depending on that, despite the fact that Mary is going to, really kind of try to solve that problem and think about how she can access her food. I mean, it sounds like it's fair to say, nevertheless, that there's now a little bit more work for her to have to do.
Yes, there's a lot of work. It's a lot more involved than what people think. It's not just going out and getting the food. In Mary's case, the probability of Mary being able to feed herself, dish out the food, and all of those things become a player. But hopefully, again, in Mary's case, who's a thinker, a planner, who says, hey, it's not just my body, it's the environment. How can I change that and create the system so that I can get all of that? Hopefully she's thought that through. For example, I utilize 4 personal care assistants who work for me throughout the week. One of them is not coming into work anymore because he doesn't want to travel during the COVID. So I have 4 guys, and the reason I have 4 guys, right, is because of backup and planning. So now I have other people who I have thought about ahead of time who can cover that shift without harming them, meaning giving them too many hours, or distracting from what I need. If that makes sense. So there's a lot of planning and a lot of extra work, if you will, but the more you do it, the more it becomes second nature. I think that's true of almost anything. I mean, you do it, the more difficult it is because you've never tried this before. So I don't think that part is any different whether you have a disability or not.
I want to, if you wouldn't mind, go through more examples. And again, just emphasizing that one thing I would love for students to take away, and myself too, is to become more mindful about these sort of lapses that many of us have around issues of ability or disability that exist, in a pandemic or not in a pandemic. I guess I feel somewhat hopeful that once we kind of pass through COVID-19, not just on issues we're talking about today, but on the many issues around income and wealth disparities, all the ways that we have inequalities in our society, or inequality of access to services and goods that we should all be able to rely on, to be mindful of those things in normal times. So maybe you could take us through a few more examples. What are some ways, what are some issues that you advocate for, or some of the people or communities that you keep in mind I know you said you want to be a little bit reluctant to group, and how, again, is the pandemic possibly shaping the contours of that?
Sure. First, let's talk about, actually, I highlighted that on my notes.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about this, guys. Whoever's looking at this video, this is not pre-planned. Durable medical equipment. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. So we're in a situation of quarantine, and I actually utilize a power wheelchair to get from point A to point B. About 2 weeks ago on a weekend, it stopped working.
Mm.
So not only are you complicated, do you have the complications of taking time to try to get an appointment to get your chair fixed? Is that even possible becomes a question, right?
Right.
Are they actually going to send anybody out to come and repair your chair? Now let's talk about how that could snowball. I don't think it would be that in my case. But if somebody is without their mobility device, because those are their quote unquote legs, what options does that leave them? Are they going to be in bed for the rest of the time if they don't, say, have a manual wheelchair or a backup wheelchair, or somebody who can push a power chair when it's dead, which actually, I don't know if people know, most power wheelchairs weigh, at least the ones that I've been associated, weigh between 300 and 400, almost 500 pounds. So if they don't have any of that kind of system in place or have thought through any of that, are they going to be in bed? And if they're in bed all the time, what's the possibility of skin breakdown or other kind of, because you're prone or lying flat, respiratory issues or anything else that could now come up and complicate a complicated situation even further. Another thing which we don't necessarily talk about in terms, especially during the age of information and information about this virus, is information and communication for persons who are deaf, who are hard of hearing, who are blind, who are deaf blind. Where are they getting their information? Are all these governors across the country and all these municipalities having sign language interpreters? Do people know and understand that everyone who's deaf does not necessarily speak American Sign Language, ASL? Some people rely on something what's called a CDI, Certified in Deaf Interpreter, which is not necessarily the same language as American Sign Language. So there are all these variables that we need to account for and manage in making sure that people are safe and sound, and could result in additional disparities or additional problems for specific populations. Another thing is personal protection equipment. You've been hearing a lot of that on the news, PPE. If you're in a situation where you're providing personal care services, you're generally dressing, feeding, maybe helping toilet, or helping with personal hygiene or bathing. So that's hands-on work. And you've got to have protection for your PCA, your helper, and yet all these gloves, all these masks, even alcohol, you can't find anywhere in the store.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens now? Are you confounding a situation or causing greater potential harm to a population that now has perhaps more exposure to the virus? Sorry, I'm moving over to my other sheet. Another thing, which as part of, as one who consults with a health insurance company, I'm hearing that there are many people who are refusing services, meaning they do need someone to come in and cook and clean and help bathe or dress or whatever. And they're saying, I don't want anybody in my house.
Yeah.
Okay. And some of those are the aging population. Other those are persons with complex care needs. What happens then? If you're not getting the kind of supports you need, are you falling? Are you taking your meds? Are you eating properly? I mean, are you getting bathed? How's your personal hygiene? Now, all of these questions now come into play, again, creating more vulnerabilities. Within the company that I'm working for, we were looking at home health aides versus personal care attendants. Well, my personal, I don't want to overgeneralize, but my personal experience with home health aides is they are not the same as someone that you've worked with, that you've trained to understand what your needs are and how to meet them. And often, and I'm sorry, I apologize again, I don't want to make generalizations, but my personal experience is that too many times home health aides come late and aren't reliable, or won't do the work the way you need it to be done. For example, if you tried to help me transfer in the way that medical systems train people to transfer, like from my chair to the bed or to the toilet, I will fall. I can guarantee you. But if you follow my method of transferring, I will be safe and sound. So again, more liability potentiality there. Health maintenance routines. If I'm not, I was going to the gym prior to this outbreak, 3 times a week, working out, and I kept my weight down. It kept me limber. It kept me functional in my ADLs, activities of daily living. I can't do that right now, and I have no alternatives, which again affects my health and well-being and functioning. Medication. Am I able to take the medication, get the medication? Is it even available? And counseling. There are people with behavioral health needs who really do rely on and need to be talking to somebody on a regular basis. Some of that is now being directed through video conferencing and telephonically, but again, those are potential issues. I haven't had personally, nor have I read that medication has been a problem with anybody during this quarantine, but that's something else. If you don't have access to a way to get the meds to you, that again could further complicate your quality of life. And then the last thing I talked about were ADLs, meaning activities of daily living. We all do these. And I just wanted to highlight the ones that I think are really critical. Bathing and getting food. And that means not just eating it, but getting the food itself, getting in and out of bed, laundry, meals, preparation, eating, cleanup, toileting, personal hygiene, and washing of hands. It's not something we think about. For example, there are some sinks that out there, not in my own home, but out there that I can't wash my hands because it's too deep. Well, that puts me at much higher risk. Things we don't think about every day. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if you've seen, at least here in Massachusetts, from the state or perhaps more locally, I'm not sure where you live, but the state or agencies representing the state or municipalities addressing some of the concerns that you just raised, or is that sort of not on the?
Well, it does vary by state. Massachusetts actually is a very fortunate state to be in. That's where I live, in Massachusetts. They have done a couple of things that I'm aware of. One is they have raised the wages of personal care attendants. On a temporary basis. I think they increased their wage $1.54 or something like that per hour, which says, hey, you're valuable, right? Stay what you're doing, right? They have also issued a lot of directives and guidance for people who use PPE and use personal care attendants and how to do that better and how to do that best. And Mass Health has indeed a system in place now whereby if you are diagnosed with COVID-19, you will be put on a priority list for receiving PPE. The other thing that has happened in Massachusetts is that there is now I think they're calling it nursing home resource, where if your loved one's in a nursing home, you now have a number you can call to find out what their status is and how they're doing.
Okay. I don't know. I know you did some work for the federal government, although I'm not sure any of that overlapped with emergency management planning, pandemic planning. The United States was regarded at one point not too long ago as being among the most well-prepared country internationally. That seems to have kind of fallen apart a little bit. Do you know if there was any thought that went into in the pandemic or emergency planning for something like we're experiencing now that addressed issues of ability and disability?
The only thing I can speak to is we know after Hurricane Katrina that FEMA was looked at very seriously about how they failed to respond to the needs of persons with disabilities. I can't tell you the degree to which that has or has not changed. I wish I could, but I don't have that information.
And do you see any indication anywhere that, again, as we move past the pandemic, that, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of attention paid to much better preparation beyond this pandemic or beyond this episode of the pandemic? Do you see any indication anywhere, maybe it's too soon, that there is any thought going into we got to be more inclusive in our addressing emergency care?
Well, I'm hopeful, let me put it that way, because again, after Hurricane Katrina, people did hold FEMA accountable, more accountable to meeting the needs. And this is really important, after 9/11, people don't think about it, but people who had mobility issues, whether that's walking, ambulation, or using a device, did not survive 9/11. And no one's really been talking about that. But it was after 9/11 that a number of committees and other actions were taken nationally to help provide a better way for persons to be able to evacuate buildings.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, I hate the fact we have to go through an emergency or have so many people die to get there, but that seems to be the way the country works. The one thing I did want to mention is, which is disturbing to me, and I don't have all the information, so what I'm about to say is based on what I've seen visually on internet and the media, and that is they have talked about nursing homes being hotspots for COVID infections. Right. And when I've seen images of those hotspots, I don't see any of the residents wearing protections, only the staff. And that gets me to thinking and wondering, to what degree are we actually putting or encouraging residents to use protection like masks and gowns and gloves versus just doing that for the staff?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. We only have just a couple minutes left, so I just want to actually bring us back to you again and just have you speak a little bit about, I mean, you clearly have chosen a life of engagement and advocacy, activism. I'm not sure what word you use, but I want, for the purpose of the students, what does it feel like to be doing that kind of work? What does it mean to you?
Well, I actually have a mantra I try to live by, and that is leave everything better than the way you found it. And that's really something I've really tried to do throughout my career, to make a difference. And hopefully the positive parts of, because we all make differences every day, and hopefully mine are more positive than negative, but to really challenge people to rethink this thing we call disability. What is the meaning and value that we are artificially, because it is all artificial, assigned to people who have those kind of differences? And I want people to engage in critical thinking and not rely on stereotypes and assumptions.
This has been a really meaningful conversation for me personally. So I want to say thank you, and thank you on behalf of the students and for you contributing your time to our class. I really appreciate it very much. And I hope if there is any broader inclusion in who gets to have a say at the table for emergency management, that you're part of that conversation. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and for offering and the invite.
Thanks so much, Burt. Take care.
Okay, you too. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.